Yeah, so it's being heard, right? People want to listen to these candid conversations. And I think brands have recognized this. Brands have now started cashing in. They've
Mm,
started launching their own podcasts. In
mm.
India, not to that extent where, it's in the
Yeah.
West right now. But do you think brands should really be investing in podcast very strategically? And what do they really stand to gain by doing this?
Yeah, a good question. Of course, we have a lot of vested interest in saying
Absolutely.
that brands and companies should do podcasts. But I think the 4 or 5 points that I will share, if any brand or company or corporate pays attention to that, it's literally a no-brainer, right? They should be doing it. And each one of these 5 points, I think, in subsequent episodes, we will, get into a lot more detail there, right? Of what and how. They benefit companies, right? But let's get started because I think this is the most important question, right? So the first reason for a company to start a podcast is access and engagement to key stakeholders, right? By key stakeholders, I mean primarily it could be your clients or your customers for a B2B business. A
Mhm.
key stakeholder could be, if you end up dealing with, government officials, right? That it's a good way to access and engage with them. If you have a key stakeholder who's a strategic partner to your business, it could be that stakeholder. It could be a wide array, right? But a lot of companies specifically use it for access and engagement with their customers or clients, right?
Mhm.
Now, what do we mean by engagement? If you have existing clients that have been doing business with you, doing a podcast and engaging them in a brilliant conversation ends up building relationship between the brand
Mhm.
and that particular stakeholder, right,
Mhm.
in some way. And secondly, by access, we mean that a lot of salespeople, when they try to get in touch with a client, they may not give them a meeting, but in a way, if you invite that same person on a podcast to have an interesting conversation, that becomes a way in which you start an association with a
Mm.
certain stakeholder that's been difficult to reach otherwise, right?
Mhm.
So you have a lot of B2B companies that have been using podcasts as a way of accessing and engaging their most important clients, right? And it's brilliant. And like I said, this is something that we've tried ourselves and it worked like magic, right? It worked like magic because most of your existing customers, you solidified your relationship further and
Mhm.
led to more and more business coming from there on. I can't
Mhm.
literally think of a single customer that didn't do business with us after coming on our podcast, right?
That's the kind of success rate you're
Oh
saying.
yeah, almost 100%, right? 100% of our
Almost 100%.
yeah, 100% of our existing customers that came and did a podcast with us continue doing business with us, right? Because now our relationship had solidified in some way. Yeah, and so many of
That's so
our I don't
interesting. Sorry, I'm jumping
yeah
in, Swapnil.
yeah
That is so
yeah
interesting because
yeah
I think, like you said, it brings a personal touch.
yeah.
Do you also think it's refreshing now for stakeholders to, instead of just, sitting and doing meetings, it's refreshing now for stakeholders to say, okay, you know what, we'll come over, we'll sit, we'll have a good chat about things. Do you think
Yeah.
that freshness is also bringing value?
Of course, I think it is, right? Because a lot of people are craving to have good conversations with other
Yeah.
people, right? Whether it's business or not, you're actually craving for that, right? So when you actually invite a stakeholder to have an interesting conversation with you, which is recorded, uh, you know, for him it's enjoyable, or him or her it's enjoyable in most
Right.
cases, right? So
Right.
yeah, I think there is a angle which is very refreshing there.
Mm.
And for me, right, it was as the host and somebody that was conducting the podcast, it was so much fun for me. I would look forward to doing it every week, and I could see that my guests enjoyed it as well, right? And even if I was having a conversation with them literally for the first time through a
Mm.
podcast, they totally enjoyed it. And all our subsequent meetings
Mm.
started off on a solid footing, so to speak, right?
Yeah, I can
And
see why. Absolutely.
yeah, and if it were just a normal sales call, I don't think that would have happened, right? In a normal
Yeah.
sale.
Yeah.
right? So we've seen the magic work firsthand, like I said, right? And that's the reason why we're so bullish
Hmm.
about this, right? So yeah, so number one reason for me is access and engagement to key or difficult to reach stakeholders, and that is especially for a B2B company, right?
Hmm.
Now, the second reason I think why anyone should, any brand or company should invest in a podcast is that it helps build thought leadership, right? Now, what does it mean, helps build thought leadership? Thought leadership is essentially your ability to come across as an expert in the domain, industry, sector, or field that you operate in, right? And through a podcast, because you're having, in a lot of times, conversations connected to your industry with the different stakeholders that you call on your podcast. A lot of very interesting takes come or insights come from the host, and a lot of interesting takes or insights or expertise is shown by even the guests that come on that particular podcast, right? So a combination of that really helps build your credibility as an expert and therefore as a thought leader. And I think, in today's day and age, Rosh, being a thought leader for every company is extremely important. And again, that's the reason why we are starting this particular podcast, right, of the Ranks Insider,
Yeah.
because we
Yeah.
want to be the thought leaders in this field, because with so much of competition, right, with so many companies fighting for the same customer in some way, customers eventually are going to want to go to the expert on a certain subject, right? And that's the way human beings have always been, and that's the way human beings have always purchased stuff, where they like going to an expert for a certain purchase or for a certain need that they have to be solved. And the same thing is going to be true here, right? You're going to want to go to the expert. So how do you build thought leadership in the modern world? The
Hmm.
primary format of many things that you do, but the primary format, in my opinion, is through a podcast, right? So that's reason number two, right? To build thought leadership for your company or for your brand, right? The third reason, which I think is equally interesting, is podcasts help build trust by humanizing the brand or company, right? Now, what does this mean? What does humanizing your company mean? If you go to the social media pages of most organizations, whether they're B2B or B2C, you see a lot of generic content. You don't actually see human beings, right, interacting and having discussions. They're just regular posts that are there, or they're ads that you make, which everybody know are doctored in some
They're
way, right?
staged.
They're staged,
They're
right? So
staged.
you're making ads on one side, or you're putting your regular content right on the
Hmm.
other side, right? But there's no way for companies or brands to really humanize themselves. And the minute a company humanizes themselves, right, a lot of trust starts building with the consumers, right, or the clients that are there. They're like, oh, I can see a lot of people that are actually a part of this thing. And that's what podcasts do for you, right?
Hmm.
People, consumers or clients actually see the humans behind the brands, and that tends to build a lot of trust towards the brand,
Hmm.
right? And that trust eventually leads to business actually taking place, right? Because I think all of us would agree that the businesses that you associate with are the businesses that you trust, right? That's when you transact with some business, right? So I think the humanizing is a very important part, right? So that would be point three. Point four, which is again very interesting, is your guests become your brand evangelists or ambassadors,
And
right?
I think that's beautiful to have.
That's beautiful, right? So what tends to happen is every time that you call somebody as a guest on your show, more often than not, that person will share that podcast on their social media
Yeah.
channels, right? So it's a de facto vote of confidence for the brand. It's without without it being too pushy, somebody's actually endorsed your brand or been an ambassador for it or an evangelist for it, right? Now, if you think of it, let me give you an example, right? So, Work Better or Upgrad Work Better, when we did the podcast, right, we would call a lot of people from the HR domain and the learning and development domain because that was our target customer in some way, right? So we invited them for the podcast. Now, when they shared the podcast on their LinkedIn, their circles more often than not were other HR professionals or other learning and development
Right.
professionals,
Right.
right? So automatically they've been brand evangelists, not generically, but they've been
Hmm.
brand evangelists on their social media to a very specific group that is again relevant to me,
Right.
right? And it was so interesting after we shot our first 10 episodes, Rosh, we had people from the industry reaching out to us proactively saying, hey, can we be guests on your podcast? Right. And that happened so quickly
Hmm.
because, again, it was shared by the guests as brand evangelists of sort
Yeah.
in their circles, which were relevant to us. Right.
And that is so
Now,
difficult to have your clients come to you.
yeah. Yeah. And it could be anyone, right?
Yeah.
Tomorrow, we could have called an academic on the
Yeah.
on the show, and he would have, shared it in his circles, which again would have brought benefits to us as a brand, right? So your guests becoming brand evangelists is a testimonial of sort that they're giving you, is like the ultimate word of mouth that they're giving you, and that by default happens every time a guest is featured on a podcast, right? Because the guest is sharing so much of interesting information, he wants his audience to
Hmm.
to hear that, right, in some way. So that's the fourth very specific point why brands should start a podcast. And lastly, I would say the fifth point is every brand, most brands and their social media, which is a very important part of their marketing mix, is extremely boring. And most brands don't have a clue as to what they need to do on their social media, right? So, as a part of the podcast, you end up creating a lot of interesting video content that you pump on your social media, right? And all of us know that today videos on all kinds of social media is what companies need to share to get the right kind of traction on their social media, right? So by default, you doing a podcast, you get the whole video, you get the clips, you get the shots, so much of video content that a company wouldn't get otherwise, and they know that video content is very important for their social media, right? So a combination of these 5 points that are that largely work for both B2B and B2C, which is number one, like access and engagement to your key stakeholders, right? Number two, building your thought leadership, right? And now, number three, you're humanizing your brand and building trust with your clients and consumers, right? Number four, your clients, the people that you call on the guests become your brand evangelists and ambassadors by sharing it on their social media. Number five, you create amazing video content for your own social media platforms, right? A combination of these five things makes it an absolute no-brainer for any brand, every brand, company, or corporate to really, start their own. And if I may add, start it through us because we're the experts at this particular subject, right? So of course, take everything that we're saying with a pinch of salt because we're,
Mm.
we're pushing our own agenda in some way. But I think it's hard to refute the logic behind the 5 points that have been shared, right? I think they are quite logical in
Yeah.
nature.